Okay, good time to start. We still have people coming in, but I think we should get started. Ready, Sonia?
Yes.
Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and for some actually good night. It's great to have you all on the second of the Dawn Talks, online conversations that have by the strange times we are living in, but which are also turning into a great method of catching up with many old friends, compañeras, partners, and so we really look forward to an exciting discussion. My name is Gita Sen, and I am General along with Maria Graciela Cuervo, who is somewhere in this gathering. I am a professor at the Public Health Foundation of India, in addition to spending most of my life and soul and heart in the work that Dawn does. Most of you probably already know about Dawn. We were founded in 1984-85 as a South feminist network. We consciously defined ourselves as feminists at a time when that wasn't that common. And we work on a range of issues that you are also probably familiar with. If you're not, I suggest you go to the Dawn website, which is www.dawnnet.org. The issues we work on are the political economy of globalization, sexual and reproductive health and rights, political ecology, and political restructuring and social transformation. As you can see, politics runs through and through everything that Dawn is about. And we do analysis, advocacy. Different of us are engaged in activism at national and regional, global levels. Among the things that's important for us here is, of course, the role that Dawn played in the famous conferences of the 1990s. But we'll come back to that in a minute. I want to just say something briefly about this series of conversations. This is the second in the series. The first one held a couple of weeks ago, had Ping from China speaking about the experiences as a Chinese feminist in the context of the pandemic. This one, as you know, is about biopolitics and the pandemic, feminist perspectives. And we have two more coming up in this series on July 16th with Kumi Samuel from Sri Lanka, speaking with Vivian Taylor from South Africa on the pandemic and human rights. And then on July 30th, we have Vanita Mukherjee speaking to Maria Graciela on the experiences of Kerala and what can be learned from them. Let me very briefly introduce this particular conversation. The term biopolitics and biopower often tends to scare people. I can just see going, oh no, Foucault. I don't understand what Foucault says. So we all know, or I hope we do, that Foucault was probably one of the most brilliant, if not the most brilliant philosophers of the late 20th century. who transformed our ways of thinking about things that we take normally completely for granted in ways that have changed politics, changed how we analyze and research, changed academia, generated a huge momentum around rethinking the relationship between people, the state, institutions, and each other. And we're going to, for those of you who go, oh no, Foucault, don't worry, we'll try and do a little bit of easy entry to it so that everyone, in fact, is on board with the conversation, which is really about what biopolitics means in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. The person I'm going to be speaking to and asking questions to is someone who really needs no introduction, Sonia Correa, who you've been seeing on your screen, founder of SOS Corpo in Recife in Brazil, one of the first and earliest of the feminist organizations in Brazil in the post-dictatorship era, and that has been working, that could work and began working explicitly on safe abortion. She was Dawn's research coordinator for SRHR, Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights, for a long period between 1992 and 2009, which is when Sonia and I were delighted to work together, to battle together in many contexts, globally and regionally. She's now research associate at the Brazilian Interdisciplinary Association for HIV/AIDS, ABIA, and is also co-chair of its Sexuality Policy Watch program, along with Richard Parker. Sonia, as you know, has been working on sexuality and reproduction issues in the larger context that Dawn works in for many, many, many years. And we're looking forward, Sonia, to a very exciting and hopefully provocative conversation. We also have asked a couple of people afterwards who I will call on to open when we move into the before we move into the open discussion, just to give 2 to 3 minutes worth of reflections on what they've heard or anything else related to the subject. So with that, let me explain the modalities. Your video and audio should be muted throughout. If you want to send a chat to all panelists and attendees, please feel free to do so. But if you want to ask a question, please do it in the Q&A tab. Don't use the chat tab because there's too many people and it's a little hard for me to keep track of questions in the general chat. So please put it on the Q&A tab. That is right next to the chat tab on your screen. And you can start putting questions at any point in the proceedings. This session is being live streamed at the same time through Facebook, and will also is being recorded and will go up on YouTube, on Dawn's YouTube, a bit later. So let me start, Sonia, by asking you the most straightforward question. What is biopolitics? Can you tell us as simply as possible? And can you tell us also what it means to look at biopolitics through?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here today, not just because this conversation is in fact a continuation of many other conversations I have had with Gita in very different occasions and moments and locations around the world since probably the late 90s. So it's a continuation of our conversation. Huh? But it's also a pleasure because there are so many people, partners, friends that I haven't seen for so long, and in the audience today is really very moving for me. Names that I haven't heard for so long, so it's a pleasure, and I hope that the conversation will also inspire all of you. Huh? And my expectation, I'm going to throw some ideas, and my expectation is that we can, in the debate, that you can add and enrich the first ideas that I will explore. And then I go to this very easy question that Gita has posed to me. What is biopolitics? So easy to respond. No, it's not so easy. You know? Biopolitics and biopower constitutes a vast and complex field of knowledge production that cannot be easily summarized, and I don't have the ambition that it's going to be exhausted. What I'm going to offer is a very graphic and certainly very imperfect version or description of it. And because of that, I'm reading not to get lost myself in that description. And as Gita said, to speak about biopolitics implies getting back to Foucault. Even though many other authors after Foucault have contributed to further theorizing to biopolitics and biopolitics and biopower and criticizing Foucault and expanding Foucault lenses. In the short paper that it was written for triggering this conversation, there are some suggestions of further readings, no? That try to cover a bit of that scope. But to get back to Foucault, I think that the first thing that is important to say is that in his frame, originally named anatomopolitics, it was not biopolitics, it was not biopower. He was thinking about the body and anatomies. Foucault historicizes how from the 16th to the 19th century, the so-called transition to modernity, the power to govern was transformed from the power to kill or suspend that towards a new form of power configuration fundamentally aimed at making live, sustaining and improving life on the one hand, and on the other, selectively is very important, letting die. This shift also implied the proliferation of much less visible manifestations of power. Let's remind that by the 16th century in Europe, the visible manifestations of power were basically the state and the church, and capital was emerging. But then this new configuration comprises devices, techniques, discourses, and practices that focuses on lives and bodies. And in this maze, scientific discourses, in particular, biomedicine occupies a very central role. This new form of power deployment is bifurcated. On the one hand, and here I'm thinking of Rosalind Petchesky, who has written extensively about that. On the one hand, it comprises the microphysics of power, the discourses, the norms, the devices, the practices used to classify, produce taxonomy, surveil, discipline and control, but that also incites, make visible, excludes, stigmatize, and punish on the basis of this knowledge and power flux. The main figures of these early formations, as you know, is the so-called Foucaultian quartet, are the homosexual, the prostitute, the procreative couple, and the masturbating child. As we know, these figures have changed with time, and we have not new figures today. On the other hand, there are the theories and techniques that are aimed at the macro management of populations, birth, rates, demographics, epidemiology, public health. These are techniques of modulation, specialization, but also homogenization. This is a domain that is very well known by feminists, including by me and Gita and others in this audience, because here is where is placed the systematically contested, but also perennially revived realm of Malthusian rationalities. We are here in the field and the realm of population control. Sex is central to both modalities of power configurations because it functions as a link between individual bodies and the species through reproduction, between the individual body and the social body. But race, and this is very important to say because sometimes it's forgotten, is the other central element of the biopolitical equation. It is a differential for determining who will live and who will die. It's a triad criteria. It's a parameter to ground the homogenizing of nation states and most principally to justify the white supremacy of the colonizers. As we know, late century Darwinian theory, not because of Darwin himself, but because of reinterpretations, has entered this landscape and has ramified towards eugenic politics, social Darwinism, which catastrophically matured towards Nazi fascism and the camps and the Holocaust. These somber specters that are now hovering over contemporary politics. Another important contribution of the biopolitical frame is the concept of governmentality, because it links with the rationality of neoliberalism in its capacity of generating forms of content and social meaning, modes of governing and subjectification. To end, in what concerns specifically COVID and biopolitics, it is productive, in my view, to follow the track of scholars that since the COVID crisis has been installed over the planet, have been suggesting that we should critically read the responses to the pandemic using both early Foucault analysis that derive from the 16th, 17th century approaches to leprosy that implied strict surveillance, disciplining, specialization, and closed institution, which is the modality that more directly leads towards the state arbitrariness and states of exception, but also to consider his later reflections that focus mostly on late 18th century management of the smallpox epidemics, which is a different mode of biopolitics. It's the so-called inoculation or securitization mode, which is more akin with liberal governmentality. It leaves a breadth of space for subjects themselves to be part of the modality and the dynamics of control and surveillance. And in addition, I do think that we should follow other authors like Roberto Esposito, the Italian philosopher, but also Judith Butler, who have been recently writing about the eugenic neo-Darwinist or deliberate neglect state responses to COVID. Is another mode of responding to the pandemic, of which my country is more than regrettably the most blatant and horrifying illustration. And I'll leave it there, and I think from there we can move forward.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that's very important, I think, for us to keep in mind is differently from the where the discipline of subjects by the ruler was explicit and clear. With the emergence of the period of modernity and the emergence of biopower and biopolitics, the subjects themselves become complicit in the process of politicization and the exercise of power. So you have all of these methods for incorporating race, gender into politics, but in which people are themselves but also, of course, biomedicine and a whole range of other ways. Your mentions and the normalization, but I'll come back to the normalization question in a minute. But your mention of smallpox makes me come up. I think we have a perfect example in the smallpox eradication program in India. And it's absolutely fascinating because after we talked the last time, I've always known this, but I went and looked into it much more carefully. And oh my goodness, my mind was completely blown by what I was able to find. In 1950, there were close to 160,000 reported cases of smallpox in India. And just like our pandemic today, the actual number of infections was typically much greater than the reported cases. In those days, it was hard to know what was going on in India's villages and who was infected. Although, of course, if you had smallpox, everybody around knew that you had smallpox. But the case fatality rate, the death rate of these reported cases was as high as 30%. 1/3 of the people would die from smallpox. And smallpox, for that reason, at the time, before the vaccination against smallpox became available, was a disease that had no cure, no times. Smallpox and the bubonic plague, the Black Death, were sort of spoken of in the same breath. And people would get desperate if either of those broke out. Now, post-independence in the 1960s, Indian strategy followed two strands. The first one is what happened in the 1960s, between 1962 and 1972. The vaccine was available by then. For a single vaccination, and it was a liquid vaccine, so it was difficult to transport, to carry around, and so on, and it was painful. So even though people thought of the vaccine, the government did its best to tell people vaccination was good for them and would prevent smallpox, people would run from it. Despite that, in the 1960s, for about a 10-year period, the Indian government did millions, hundreds of millions of vaccinations. And it was very important for the world eradication of smallpox. India contributed 60% of smallpox cases. So it was very important that it be eradicated in India. But despite all of these vaccinations, by the end of the 1960s, the WHO was saying, we're not getting on top of this. We're not eradicating it. It's still there. The reservoir is there. It will keep coming back every time in the smallpox season. And then in 1972, a very different approach came in, which was, and WHO itself called it the surveillance containment approach. And in that surveillance containment approach, teams of health workers, literally hundreds upon thousands of health workers, would go from village to village to village of the hundreds of thousands of villages in India, identifying cases, conducting house-to-house searches on a mass form of quarantine. And if there was a case, they would then make sure to vaccinate everybody around who could possibly be a contact. So that era's contact tracing quarantines were going on at that time on a mass scale. And that mass scale was data-driven very heavily. In fact, someone said that just 1 month would produce 8 tons of paper forms that kept track of who was being vaccinated, who was found, where they had been, what had been there, of these hundreds of thousands of health workers out there. A very interesting thing I found, and Sonia, you'll be fascinated by this, was that information, IEC, of course, huge advertising campaigns were very important in this period. But among the things that was there, and I actually saw the form for the provision of incentives to tell on your neighbor. So everybody who reported a case got at that time 100 rupees for reporting on the case. The first person who reported on the case got 100 rupees. And this, of course, reminds us of a great thing that came shortly afterwards. But it was successful. In 3 years, the last case, in 1975, the last smallpox case in India was found. And over the next 2 to 3 years, WHO and everybody was involved to trying to make sure. So the house-to-house searches went on, that it was indeed the last case. And cases every time they heard, but they only found chickenpox. And they finally, WHO declared in 1979 that smallpox had been globally eradicated. Step back just a minute. In 1973, Mrs. Gandhi, in 1972, Indira Gandhi, who was the prime minister at that time and a very popular prime minister, was in fact fully behind this campaign. In 1975, she declared a state of emergency, political emergency in India. She became a mini dictator in the country. And among the elements, as all Indians know, that was central to that dictatorship was a mass sterilization campaign. That mass sterilization campaign used all of the techniques that had been learned in the smallpox eradication campaign, including the provision of incentives for bringing your neighbor to the camp of health workers to, in fact, conduct sterilizations. There's one more element that is crucial because of this, and because it was male vasectomies that were being done, that Mrs. Gandhi lost the elections when they were called a short while later. Be that as it may, there's no question but that there were huge human rights violations, many atrocities that were conducted of this process is that after that, it has never been possible for the family welfare program in India to pick up male sterilization, which, as we know, and in fact, it depends overwhelmingly on female sterilizations. And that's because, in fact, of the very bad name that male sterilization got, even though it's far simpler and far easier, far safer than female sterilization, it's never been possible for male sterilization to pick up in a big way in India since that process. So gender at least came in, but certainly this is one of the best examples I can think of from the Indian context of biopower and biopolitics at work, done in the name of public health. And as we know, the family planning program was all done in the name of public health as well. We need to discipline healthier families. And all of the controls that we've seen, all of the rigidities and the atrocities in the program have flowed from this. So the dark side of public health measures converted into draconian controls is in fact what we can see in this example. And I'm wondering, Sonia, you mentioned briefly something about Brazil in your last comment. Does something like this help us to understand the different policy responses at this time? Because public health is very difficult for people to argue against. Who can be against motherhood, apple pie, public health? Nobody can be against public health. And yet public health measures brought in are seen as good for everybody, as a public good, then end up having a very dark side to them. So I wonder if you can comment on that.
Yeah, I can. Before going that, I think that the story you tell is fascinating because when thinking in theoretical terms of biopolitics and biopower, it's very interesting that we are always taken back in time to find that peculiar workings of power over bodies and lives that appear today have been with us much longer. We have always to get back in time and historicize. Like the contemporary is never fully contemporary. It has always a sort of genealogy behind it. No? And it's also interesting, Gita, that to remind that Foucault's model of smallpox inoculation modality of biopolitics happened, what he saw in Europe in the late 18th century was concomitant to the Malthus's statistics, or the very first debates on population, the problem of population, and Malthusian very pessimistic and moralistic views about the ways the poor had sex and reproduced. So it's interesting that smallpox and population control, even in Europe at that point, were being discussed and debated or subjects of discussion at the same time. I think it's also important to remind that the response to HIV/AIDS was deeply biopolitical, and both in terms of effects of stigmatization, the construction of vectors of disease that were stigmatized, that were excluded, marginalized, the cancer gay, the sex workers. This is peculiar of biopolitics, but also in many places has led to confinement, like confinement of the 17th century, like Cuba has put people confined into prisons because they had HIV/AIDS. And Sophia Gruskin is with us. She can tell stories about this was happening not very long ago in Vietnam, for example. So this has not disappeared. Huh? Moving to Brazil, what I think it's important to underline here is that I agree with these authors that are thinking that when talking about COVID, we have not to pick up just one of the Foucaultian frames, but try to look at the various Foucaultian frames and see how they fit or they do not fit into the peculiar context. And I think that at least we have a tripartite mosaic here. One is that many places are decidedly using the classical model of surveillance, specialization, control, confinement, very strictly, that including is building up towards the states of exception, like you described for India under Indira. Huh? Other countries are mostly Europeans, but not just Europe, like New Zealand is one example. We can perhaps say that Taiwan or even Korea is this more modulated response to COVID, where rules of confinement, rules of social isolation are somehow negotiated with society. We can say that it's more democratic. I'm a little bit afraid of using the term democratic when speaking of biopolitics, but let's say it is more negotiated. And then you have this, it's really a neo-Darwinist approach. And this is what the president of Brazil is doing, but he's not alone in that. We have other cases. We have seen Boris Johnson moving into that direction to begin with, and then when he got COVID himself, he shifted the gears towards a more modulated mode of responding. Trump contained by other forces, but he himself is speaking that same language, which is it's the idea of the herd immunity. As much people get infected, the better, the quicker we are going to get out of this, and the economy is going to come back again. Enterprises will not be killed by the pandemic. This is the discourse of Brazilian entrepreneurs to the Supreme Court a few months ago. So, and this is social Darwinism. Huh? It's dark social Darwinism because it's really let them die. The vulnerable people.
You mean survival of the fittest?
It's survival of the fittest at its best. If the old people are going to die, they're going to die. If indigenous people are going to die, and they have died like flies throughout the history of the Brazilian colonization and colonization at large, I mean, it's because they are not fit enough. They are not strong enough. Huh? Those who are strong are going to survive. And we have seen this spoken up in discourses. Huh? There was a Texas official who said that bluntly in the US. You have sent me a video of a doctor in Sweden, which is another country, because this is not, what is interesting about this pattern is that it's not specifically from the South or the North, it's more or less everywhere. Another example, and with ideological opposites, if you want, because it's happening the same thing in Nicaragua. Ortega is behaving exactly like that. Huh? Just letting the pandemics do its work. Huh? It's really living the pandemic free and deploying discourses that we are strong, that we are going to survive, that God is going to protect, that the revolution is going to protect us. Huh? And I think Mexico is somehow more or less in the same direction, because what López Obrador has been saying lately is not very different. So this is not the dominant pattern in the response, but I would say it's the most somber, huh? and perhaps the most perverse, huh? Because take us back to a very, it's really necropolitics, it's thanatos politics done in a manner that it's totally unacceptable, and it's really repugnant.
But let me ask you a question exactly about that. And can I ask if I can be heard now? Because there was a problem with my audio earlier. can Dawn Combs please? Okay.
Hi, Gita. Your sound is a little low.
I can't do anything more about it.
Better.
This is what it is. But you can hear me. It's not breaking. I'm sorry about that. It's too low. I don't know. This is the same problem we had the other day.
Gita, meanwhile, you resolve your sound problem. Let me say something that I think is important.
Sure.
Not to create confusion. What I'm saying, I'm talking about sort of ideal types, Weberian ideal types. You have the leper model or the confinement model, and you have the inoculation, the smallpox model, and you have this neo-Darwinist model. Nowhere this is perfectly like that. It's always a little bit hybrid. You're going to have, like in Brazil, you have Bolsonaro doing this, his neo-Darwinist approach and deployment of discourses, but you have other areas of the state and other actors doing different things. And I think like Caroline in India is doing a different thing than what the center is doing. So we have to be flexible in that understanding. It's not a master explanation.
Right. But I wanted to ask you actually a slightly different question. One of the things about biopolitics, especially in the context of a pandemic, is that dark measures are done in the name of a public good, something positive. Whereas the kind of let them die social Darwinism that is going on, I mean, it's a far stretch to say, you know, we will have herd immunity. And so we let everybody, as in the Swedish case. What was very shocking about the Swedish case was this young doctor saying he had received instructions that anyone over the age of 80, if they tested positive, to just give them morphine, keep them in the care center, give them morphine, and basically let them die. And anybody over the age of 60 with prior conditions like diabetes or a heart problem or something else, the same story. Now that is so shocking, and it's clearly not widely known that you cannot justify that in the modern world as somehow being public good. This is clear, as you call it, necropolitics, but public bad. So I wonder where we step over from the kind of nice screen of public health into rampant authoritarianism, tending to what you call necropolitics.
Now, I think that one element that has to be grasped into that is that the justification or the ideology justifying this neo-Darwinian necropolitics is that people cannot live without the economy. So what is the public good is the economy. We have to save the economy to ensure the life of people. So this is one a very important piece of this. What is the public good here is not anymore persons, but is the market, is the economy, the enterprises. The entrepreneurs that went visiting Bolsonaro and then run through the main square in Brasilia to make an impromptu visit to the Supreme Court without even announcing that we're going there. They said that bluntly. We came here because rules of social isolation, quarantine, these draconian rules, they are going to kill the enterprises. This is the language that they have used. I've seen an advertisement of a bank that says, Pandemics come and go. Markets remain. So it's impossible to properly grab this return of late 19th century neo-Darwinism, social Darwinism, without articulating it properly with the conditions of neoliberalism. I mean, this is really a form of neoliberal governmentality, which is different from the other modalities. And this is why there are tensions. This is why Bolsonaro has been evicting his health ministers in a row, 1 and 2, and now he has the military there that is going to govern that rationality. So, and I think this is to be looked at more closely.
Let me ask you now, just to shift gear a little bit, to talk about how gender and sexuality are playing out in the biopolitics of this pandemic.
Well, first, I think we have to consider all biopolitical imprints or markers. It's not just gender and sexuality we have to take into account. Race, and when I'm meaning race here, I'm also talking about ethnicity and the proxies, because sometimes a migrant is a proxy to a racialized person. In other places, a religious minority, or let's say Muslims in India, it's not that it's racial, but it is a proxy to the notion of race and racialization of biopolitics. So I think that these biopolitical markers of race in this broader sense, but sexuality and gender, have to be taken into account to map out properly and contest the stark differential vulnerabilities of people in face of the pandemic. As lots of people have been saying, the virus, as it happened with HIV/AIDS, is democratic. The virus is not choosing where it's going everywhere. In all of Latin America, the virus has arrived through the bodies of rich people that were traveling in Europe. They have been the vectors, quote unquote, of the virus, but they have not, strangely enough, been portrayed as vectors. The vectors were the Chinese, the vectors were the Venezuelan refugees in the north of the country. So that, and the vulnerability to COVID, either in terms of exposure to the virus, either in terms of being able to access treatment or testing, it's crossed by socioeconomic differentials, but also by these biopolitical markers. Very clearly, a Black transgender sex worker in Brazil is much more vulnerable, both to exposure, to lack of access to treatment, and to be a victim of this necropolitics that is being implemented in the country. The same applies to indigenous people, which is a racial marker. This is one thing. The other is the stigmatization, the notion of vectors. This comes directly, we have to remind, this were the prostitutes that were the propellers and the carriers of syphilis in the 19th century. And then we had the HIV/AIDS, the AIDS as the vector. And now this has expanded. We have many other vectors. We have Chinese, sometimes we have Black people. I saw I read a Trump advisor saying that he was not saying that Black people in the US are the vectors, but he directly said that Black people, well, they get COVID because the way they are obese, they have comorbidities. It was like race is responsible for the higher level of infection of Black people in the US. It's really horrendous. So this idea of a vector, if a vector is at the same time racialized, gendered, and or has a very strong sexual imprint, the possibility that this person is going to be more marginalized or subject to violence is very clear. And I have looked specifically into problems of specialization, of rules of segregation. In the cases, as you may know, and the paper is there if you want to read, in the cases of Panama, Peru, and Colombia, two cities in Colombia, Bogota and Cartagena. I don't know exactly from where this came. I'm going to look more closely to it. But governments, the state decided that to define, to reduce the levels of agglomeration in the urban areas, they established that people could live home one day and another on the basis of sex and gender. They established a sex-gender segregation pattern. So men go one day and women go in another day. What is the problem here? Is that immediately gender non-binary people were nowhere. Who are they? No? So there were many cases, particularly in Panama, but also in Peru, where transgender people were immediately subject to police violence, because at the same time, this segregation is not happening in normality. It's a condition where you have police on the street, in some places even the army is on the street to control the very strict rules of confinement, of segregation, there's surveillance. So there were many, many cases of trans people being abused, taken to the police because they were out of home in the wrong day because their identity card said they were men and they should not be on the street. This was one effect. The other effect that was less visible immediately is that when you use that criteria, gender or sex as a criteria, what you do is that you reify, you reiterate gender orders as they are. You naturalize gender orders, even in what concerns man and woman, binary sex or binary gender. What happened in Peru is that immediately, because women are those who can usually go out to buy things, the day that they went out, there were more people in the street. And immediately, there was a discourse being deployed saying that women do not know how to behave during the pandemic because they are very disorganized, they get together, they are not respected. Just reiterating patterns of discrimination that are ingrained in gender orders. And this is much more difficult to interrogate and destabilize because it's very naturalized. It's like the segregation, the sex segregation of trains in Mumbai, or the sex segregation of subway wagons in the case of Rio and other cities. It's thought as natural.
What you're saying reminds me of something. It was one of the early tragic events in India, where, as many of you know, the informal sector's migrant workers were left to their own devices when the very strict lockdown was imposed and began walking back home hundreds of thousands of kilometers to their villages. And the best way to do that, obviously they're not following a compass, is to follow the railroad tracks, because that's how you know how to get home. Mm-hmm. And 16 of them fell asleep on the railway tracks because everyone had been told the trains are not running anymore, and were killed by a goods train that came barreling down. But among the responses that came was, what were they doing walking on the railway tracks anyway and sleeping on the railway tracks? Don't they know better? And it was so in this case, it was class, economic class at work. So it's all of the fractures and divisions in society are in fact highlighted and exacerbated by the crisis of the pandemic.
You can say they are biopoliticized in the sense that they are accused, they become responsible for that because they were disobeying and they do not know, the idea that you don't know how to behave, conduct.
Yeah,
do not know the proper conduct is very central to biopolitics. Either you're thinking in terms of class or in terms of race or in terms of gender and sexuality. Bad conduct, codes of conduct is a very central piece of that domestication that biopolitics deploys in social formations, and that we incorporate ourselves. That's the key question. It's very hard to interrogate gender segregated rules of the public space because we ourselves think that they are natural. I had Angela Freitas is in the debate, and she knows how I screaming, me and few others, when a very populist right-wing evangelic governor in Rio, female, decided to establish the sex segregation of the trains and subways in Rio, because a large part of the feminist movement was applauding, thinking that it was good because it was protecting women from male violence in the trains, when segregation of public spaces is something to be interrogated and contested, always. Imagine, as I say in my paper, imagine if the rules were based on race. This would be a scandal. You put just white people in one wagon and black people in the other. This would be entirely unacceptable in most places around the world. Yet you do that with gender and it sounds natural, normal.
Natural, yeah.
And because it's so interiorized.
Okay, so I'm going now to move us to the discussion part of this, Sonia, and
Okay.
I'd like first to call on Ros Petchesky. Ros, are you there? If you are, can you unmute yourself and turn your video on? There. Great.
I'm here.
Hi.
Oh, Ros.
Hey. Well, first let me just say, oh, should I start?
Yes, go ahead. You can say whatever you like. You have to.
Oh, it's so lovely, huh? We are starting.
I feel like I've been learning from Sonia and Gita for most of my life. So
And we have been learning from you.
Vice versa.
so it's fantastic.
It's totally reciprocal.
Alrighty. Well, I just jotted a few notes of things I wanted. There's one main thing. I mean, of course, I'll go back to Foucault, but the 16th, 17th century, I read one piece that was fascinating. If you taught political theory as I did, and you taught Hobbes, and you had that incredible frontispiece of the Leviathan with all the little people inside it, this scholar pointed out that right at the edge, there's this little figure who has a hood that's pointed. And that's the plague doctor who's guarding, guarding the boundary of the city. There's become a whole cottage industry of the history of plagues. And what's fascinating part of it is how little has changed. I mean, the techniques of dealing with plagues and pandemics are so primitive. Gita's story about India and the smallpox was just incredible, very fascinating. But I want to raise something different, and I think going back to Foucault, I always wanted to do this. The thing that didn't come up here is resistance. And Foucault was very aware and very celebrating of resistance, although I think he underestimated, and he was really thinking of the gay men's movement. But, you know, I wonder if he could have anticipated the massive uprising of the most marginalized people. And I think, excuse me if I'm too US centered here. I mean, that's where I'm working and living now and very involved in activism. But if you had, and you saw this, Sonia, you posted it, you had a protest of 15,000 Black trans people or people who were celebrating and saying Black trans lives matter in the streets in Brooklyn. That was a historic moment. That was something never happened before. And the feeling of empowerment. And now we've had several lectures and we've had, you know, webinars with Black trans leaders and mothers and people. I mean, it's just really, really exciting. And, you know, Foucault knew about resistance from anti-colonialism to sexual gender outlaws and so on, but could he have anticipated this? The other side of the coin, because all of what you've said has focused on these, you know, very contradictory, very dialectical dynamics in COVID. We have a form of resistance, and it's the right-wing resistance. And
Yeah.
it's people who refuse to wear masks in the name of my personal freedom. This is my freedom of choice.
Yeah.
And so this goes to the whole discussion of public health. And public health, you know, pitting public health versus the economy, pitting public health versus individual rights. That's a dilemma. I mean, it's not a dilemma. We know that's wrong, you know, and we're going to tell people to wear masks. But should they be forced to wear masks? And how does that bring in another form of biopolitical control? I think it's a complicated question. Just one more thing. I really enjoyed the discussion of, you know, the dark measures, the neo-Darwinist approach, the survival of the herd immunity, let them die. I think it's very, very important to be aware of that as a form of neo-Darwinism and a form of necropolitics. And it's happening here mostly in prisons. The incarcerated
Everywhere.
vulnerable, and prisons everywhere. Prisons incarcerate, and they too are rising up. In San Quentin prison in California, which has thousands who become infected because they brought prisoners from another prison, they brought them into San Quentin, and now thousands of them. And I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, we've had prison uprisings. Prisoners have gone on hunger strike, prisoners in Palestine, prisoners in California, prisoners. I don't know what will happen, but they are very aware that they are being confined to die, and they were not sentenced to death. And a lot of people in prisons and jails haven't even been convicted of anything. They're in pretrial detention. So it really is a matter of saying, the message is, all those populations, those marginal populations, let them die. And that's not just a biopolitical, it's also a neoliberal economic strategy. We don't need those people for profits or for anything. So anyway, it's really a terrible time. But thank you. This is a wonderful thing you're doing, Dawn.
Lovely to have you here.
But
Lovely to have you with us.
I'd love to be with you. You can mute me now if you want.
Let me just quickly say something to that. The neoliberal part of what you just said. It's not just that, oh, let them die. There have actually been attempts to say it might be good for society if these old people die off, because we don't have to bear the costs anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Or if these sick people die off. So then we have much more healthy, younger, productive populations. We don't have to bear the costs of taking care of the sick and the old. And that's good for the economy. That's sort of necropolitics carried to an extreme. I'm now going to just quickly ask Gloria Carreaga Gloria, are you there? And if you are, if you can just unmute.
She's going to be on mute.
I know that Gloria was there.
Yes.
Yes.
Ah.
Okay.
We
Great.
don't have,
Hi, good morning.
we cannot see you. That's all. Ah, as
Okay.
needed.
Hola, Gloria.
Hola. Nice to see you.
Let me just do one thing which I was very bad at. For those who don't know, Ros Petchesky was professor emerita at Hunter College, a professor of political science for many, many years there. She was a winner of the so-called, we all hate the term, but it's called the MacArthur Genius Award in 1995, and has been a long time analyst and advocate on sexuality and sexuality, reproduction, and gender. Gloria is a social psychologist and has been teaching at UNAM, the Autonomous University in Mexico, for many, many years. Was co-secretary general of ILGA, the International Lesbian and Gay Alliance or Association. Association for a number of years and has worked on gender and sexuality for a long time. Okay, Gloria, over to you for very brief comments.
Well, I think that what LGBT people are facing now in this pandemic is a very difficult situation, because, as you know, the situation of women locked in the house has been highlighted very much, but nobody's talking about the homophobia within the families. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is something that happens in many, many families, and that those families that we build on with our friends and colleagues are now far away, and we are closed in our own families, facing lots of discrimination and in many cases kind of isolations in the house. I mean that many people do not have access to privacy. They don't have any access to the tools that they need. I mean, even a computer, a telephone, to have an exchange with others, and in many cases, even to do the work they need to. Talking about other issues, about the many LGBT people, professionals, LGBT people, used to look for some flexible work, flexible labor, because they didn't want to face the homophobia within the business spaces. Mm-hmm. So now with this pandemic, they are losing their jobs, even being a very successful professionals. Now, because of this flexibility, they have no contracts, they have no social security, they have nothing, no labor protection. And this is really a pain for many of us. And as we have many people now working on the streets with giving some supports to some transgender people, mostly of them the sexual workers, that the government decided to close the hotels, all the hotels, even the small shelters that were working more like shelters than hotels. And many of these sexual workers are now on the streets. They have they're lacking of housing, and I think that there's a big work that some organizations, mostly trans organizations, are working with. So the panorama that we are that we're facing is very, very bad. I mean, it's only, we are safe only those small line of LGBT people who have a formal work, a formal contract, and I think that, but this is not the situation for most of us. Even we were discussing about yesterday about all a high number of LGBT people who are in the arts. I mean that they are artists, that they are playing different roles in the bars and in the restaurants. So there's a really a very bad situation for many of us. And just a small thing to say that the crimes against LGBT, at least in Mexico, they have not stopped. Even within the pandemic, we're facing homophobic and transphobic crimes every single week. So we are really aware about what's happening here. Huh?
Yeah. I mean, it's very much what Sonia was saying earlier about, and that we were talking about, that people who are vulnerable, even in so-called normal times, have become much, much more vulnerable in the context of this pandemic. But it's not that they are vulnerable like some act of God. It is because all of the divisions and the oppressions in society are coming to the surface and are given permission to come to the surface. I think that's the reality that so many places are facing.
Yes, it's very clear that the pandemic has highlighted all the empty spaces that we had in terms of the human rights protection. I mean, there were a lot of human rights protections, and now the pandemic has highlighted all the different ways of discrimination, marginalization that the societies are facing now.
Yeah.
May I say something?
Please.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
2 things. Later, I want to say something about Ross' intervention on resistance in Foucault, because I think it's very important. But right now, I want to dialogue with what Gloria said. 2 things that are very important. First, what you're talking about is this: the biopolitical markers of these people make their lives much more difficult during the pandemics. Huh? For example, the crisis of sex workers, we gave a lot of attention in our last bulletin on that, because it's a global crisis. Not just because they are sex workers, but because, like health professionals, their type of work is a contact, is a body contact work. So this is sort of double marker that they are vectors. It's very, very, really a dramatic situation. It's economic and at the same time biopolitical. And something, Gloria, is that the number of young lesbian, gay, trans people that are committing suicide, we have not yet started counting them. Huh? Yeah. I had 2 people in Brazil, a very young trans man just committed suicide 2 days ago. You were the person who called attention to that. A young lesbian scholar, Black lesbian scholar from Colombia, who was working in a project that I'm part of, committed suicide 3 weeks ago. So we have not even started counting those corpses. Huh? And there's the case of Korea, where the pandemic was contained, is considered a good model, but where a new bout of COVID started in the gay bar area of Seoul. Because they track everything, they identify that the new emergence of the virus started in that point. And I read a press report that interviewed the person who was one of the persons infected in the gay bar area. And he said exactly what you said. He said, we gay people do not have families. we stay alone at home. Our families is our networks of sociability. And this sociability is not find easy. It's not the neighbors. Huh? It's not the people living in the same building. We have to go to those places, not because we want to have sex. We go to those places to find friends. Huh? And this became a spot of infection, and right away there was a stigmatization. So it's really important what you're saying to complement this differential impact of biopolitics and sexuality in COVID. Is really critical from my point of view.
And maybe I can add that at the same time, for many people are now finding some more understanding about their situations, even in some families that are not very repressive or very against homophobia. I mean that they are not so homophobic. I think that this brings a chance for those who are talking and explaining and having a new exchange with the family. It's a new opportunity to make some moves within the family. I think that we have to see both things. Even in many cases, in some cases, people have said that they now know more their neighbors and they didn't know who were living in the same building. So this is something that will bring many new things at the same time. I know we're facing very, very bad situation, but there are some new windows that we have to work in.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Gloria. Sonia, I'm going to ask you a question that showed up in the chat some time back about resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And social movements. So can you said you were going to come back to that issue anyway.
Yeah, I think that what Ross said about resistance in Foucault is very critical, because Foucault theorizing is indeed very gloomy and somber and sometimes very depressive. In fact, you read it and you say, wow, what we do about this? Huh? It's like we are caught into this greed of control and surveillance and interiorization of the rules. Is there, it's a sort of a matrix. Can we get out of this? So, but Foucault has also written extensively about resistance and points of resistance to find the proper point where resistance can flourish. And one, it's important what Ross said about the prisons, because one of the places where he has looked for resistance, and he has even politically worked towards the resistance, was exactly the prison system. This is one of his main work in terms of political work, was the prison system. But there's a marvelous, I tried to find it here, I could not find right away, but I'm going to send to everybody. There's a marvelous paragraph that I have quoted so many times of Foucault, where he says, oh, okay, the notion of the right to life is embedded in biopolitics. Huh? It's totally like soaked by the elements of biopolitics. On the other hand, it is a place where we can struggle for the right to live, to the right to be who one wants to be, to the right to have justice, to the right not to be submitted to surveillance. It's a very, I haven't used that paragraph many times, because it says that just like the state is a space of contestation, the state is powerful. The state detains the monopoly of violence. The state can be very violent, can be coercive, but it's a place of contestation. Capitalism is full contestation. The same thing, biopolitics is also the grounds for contestation, and it needs to be contested, and there are ways of contesting it. Nicholas Rose, the British sociologist, in fact, has framed the notion of biopolitical citizens, or biological citizens, people that struggle within the frame of biopolitics, and certainly feminists struggling for abortion, against population control, discussing assisted reproductive technologies, surrogacy. It's a form of resistance and politics within biopolitics. And I think it's important to call attention to that. But it requires different modalities of understanding. Huh? And this is why I think this conversation is so important. Not always the modalities we use for political resistance and political mobilizing work properly in the best way possible when you're dealing with the grids of biopolitics.
Yeah. The question, of course, is what about this particular moment? Because in as much as Roz spoke about Black Lives Matter, having the entire resistance and movement that has come up in the US and then spread to many other countries, the anti-racism uprisings that have taken place in different countries. But in our context, for instance, in India, and I was today just watching an interview with 3 activists who had been very important in the pre-pandemic social uprisings in India that you know about and that everyone knows about. The uprisings around the protection of the Constitution and on the issue of citizenship that took place. And those have actually are submerged at this point. They haven't gone away, they are submerged. And the moment is being used right now to bring all kinds of coercion and coercive measures against using the cover of the pandemic against those who dared to protest. And as someone said, it isn't just that young people protested. It isn't just that Muslims protested. For Muslim women to protest, that was too much for the ruling dispensation. And now all the weight of the state, the might of the state, is being brought against these people using the cover of the pandemic. So in terms of this, I mean, would you agree that just as with the social divisions, the pandemic makes them even sharper? When it comes to social movements and the conditions for social movements, those also become, in a sense, highlighted and exacerbated in the context of the pandemic.
Sure, I totally agree, because biopolitics is sort of a terrain. This maze is a terrain. It's like a bottle from where, or a lab containment where very easily states of exception, state arbitrariness can jump from. It's like this horrendous genius that jumps out of that box, because the terrain facilitates that. That's why we have so many states taking stringent measures, like India is one example, but we see the same thing in Sri Lanka. And it's true that if you're politically mobilized already against this, you're already in the terrain of contesting the state, you're contesting the state. And then you have overpowering rules of containment and repression and coercion by the state. And you're there on the spot. You're the main target right away. It's like the easiest target right away. You become the easiest target because states of exception will jump out of biopolitical conditions. And this is what many of the authors have been saying, including people writing now. There was a whole debate about Giorgio Agamben's position, but in fact, what he was trying to say, though I don't agree with everything he said, is that, well, this is a condition from where we can easily jump into very into the state of exceptionality that is going to give the state all the possibilities of doing whatever they want. And this is happening in many places.
So, Sonia, we're coming close to the end of this session. So
there's one question by Horacio that I wanted to respond, because I think it's important for Brazil.
Go ahead.
Horacio Siveri asked me, I'm going to read it. You brought the key role of the economy within Bolsonaro neoliberal, neo-Darwinist discourse. Only I would like if you could elaborate on the ways the workings of this framing is gendered, racialized, class, and perhaps has at the center the figure of the white male emerging middle-class entrepreneur that he appeals to. This is very important if you're thinking about gender and sexuality. At the center of the political transformation that shifted Brazil towards this neo-fascist regime, the question of masculinity is very, very, very critical. It's at the center of that. This is not to say that women are not part of that assemblage. There are many female voices. One element of the emergence of the right wing in Brazil is that we now have a very well-organized women's right-wing movement, some of them elected, and this is not trivial, and we have to address it. But yet, the figure of the male is very important. And I think that Horacio also asked about the military in this composition of Brazil. So you have the male and the military. I think that the military are being the implementers of this Darwinist program, neo-Darwinist program in response to COVID. And that's not surprising, given that dying or letting die is exactly what the military are formed to do. This is about war. And war is about killing, dying, and letting die. So it's not accidental that he has so many, 30 people or more in the Ministry of Health. But the other piece of the white male, yesterday, a new survey came out that was done by Fundação Getúlio Vargas São Paulo with the newspaper Estado de São Paulo on who are the right-wingers. They are talking the right-wingers broadly, is not the extreme right. But that survey, it's appalling. It tells that 70% of these people are men, those who say who are right-wing. 60% of them are white. 67% of them are white. And 50% of them are over 40. And no, 60% are over 40, and 50% of them are liberals, entrepreneurs and liberals. So it really fits the picture. What is most surprising for me is that in terms of religion, 30% of them, 39% of them are neither evangelical nor Catholic. They are Jews. So the Jews, the Jewish males, which in the Brazilian population, the total Jewish population is 0.3%. 30% of those males define themselves as right-wing or conservative. It's even a little bit higher than the evangelicals. This is a very, me and my friend Isabella, who are working together, we are trying to figure out what to do with this data, but I think, and then we have the Catholics and evangelicals, which is expected, but it is, you're totally right, Horacio. We cannot talk about that without talking about manhood and toxic masculinities and the place of man in the economics.
Yeah. I think toxic masculinity is the term that is that describes what is happening in so many parts of the world at this point. It was there before, and it's showing up now in the context of the response to the pandemic. Friends, we've sort of come towards the end of this session. I think, as I said, we have 2 more such talks, one on July 16 and one on July 30th. Please go to the Dawn website if you want to get more details about those, and that information is coming up on the chat even as we speak. So that we end on a positive note. I just want to say that part of what is happening here is in fact resistance. This form of exchange is one completely digital capitalism at work, but also, as can be turned around, as with all biopolitics, we can resist using those tools as well. And the first step in that resistance is the sharing of information and the importance to realize that, yes, things are changing. We are sort of balancing ourselves with an earthquake that is changing many things, but our values have not gone, our connections have not gone. And from the side of Dawn, I want to invite you to stay in touch with us and see you hopefully at the next Dawn talks as well. Look out for it in the usual social media and everywhere else. Thank you, everybody. First of all, a big, big thank you to Sonia for being our speaker for today, to Roz and Gloria for giving us those very interesting comments, and to all of you for a very lively chat. We couldn't get to all of the millions of questions that were flying around all over, but you know what that means. But I think it's been a very exciting watching the chat as well. And to all our friends, old and new, who've shown up for this session and who are in the chat. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Hasta luego. Arrivederci. Namaste. Au revoir. See you soon. And Sonia, obrigada.
De nada. De nada.
Okay.
Yeah, it was great. It was great. Let me just say one minor thing. I think, as Gita said, the state of the world is not exactly the best possible. It's very somber. It's very difficult. But I think in a positive way, we must take COVID at a sort of a prism, of a lens that allows us to see what was already abnormal in the world. Open windows of old, amplified, and open windows of new understandings and analysis. And I think we have to keep those windows open for the next stage or what comes next.
Okay, thank you and bye everyone. Thank you to the Dawn Comms team for sticking with us throughout. Thank you everybody. We're going to leave now. Thanks very much. Goodbye. And look out for the recording if you're interested. It will be up soon. Bye-bye.
Ciao.